The last loaf came out of the oven at 5:47 in the morning, the way it always did. Nadia set it on the cooling rack and stood back, watching the steam rise off the crust in the cold kitchen air. She pressed her palm briefly to the counter, steadying herself. Her feet ached. They had been aching since about 2 years into this, when she stopped being able to afford the good shoes, and she had learned not to think too hard about it. She had learned not to think too hard about a lot of things if she wanted to keep going. The flour on her forearms was already drying white, and outside the window above the prep sink, the sky over the block was turning from black to grey. Another morning at Layla's. Another morning she had made it through. She pulled the mixing bowls from the sink drain where they'd been soaking and stacked them on the shelf. She wiped down the prep counter. She portioned the butter for the next batch and left it at room temperature where it would soften by the time she needed it, which was another thing she had learned from her mother. The way butter knows what it's doing if you let it do it. The way most things in a kitchen are patient if you are patient too. The bakery had belonged to her mother before it belonged to her. Layla herself had opened it 31 years ago in this same narrow storefront on Clement Street with a hand-lettered sign in the window and a second-hand convection oven that took 2 men to carry up the front steps. Nadia had grown up behind this counter. She had done homework at the small table in the back corner while yeast breads proofed in the warmer. She had learned the difference between a good crust and a burnt one before she learned long division. She had learned to read a customer's face through the glass case and know before they said anything which of the 2 remaining slices they would point to. When her mother got sick 5 years ago, Nadia moved back from across the city and took the early shift so Layla could rest. She drove across town at 3:30 in the morning, 3 days a week, and then 5, and started the ovens in the dark, and when Layla was well enough to come in, she came in. And when she wasn't, Nadia ran it alone. They did not talk much about the sickness during those shifts. They talked about bread. Layla would stand at the counter with her coffee and tell Nadia things she already knew about why you fold rather than stir and what the dough is telling you when it resists. Nadia listened each time as though she were hearing it fresh because she understood that her mother needed to be the one who knew things, and that need was worth honouring. Layla passed 18 months after the diagnosis. The last weeks were in a hospice room that smelled of antiseptic and whatever flowers Nadia's aunt brought each day, which were always different and always too bright. On the last good day, Layla asked Nadia to bring her a piece of the sesame honey loaf, which was the bread she was most proud of, the one that had given Layla's its small local reputation. Nadia brought a slice wrapped in wax paper, and Layla ate half of it slowly and said it was right. She said, "You know how to let it breathe." She meant the bread. She probably meant more than that. Nadia had tried twice after the funeral to imagine closing. The first time she got as far as calling the landlord's office and asking a question she didn't finish, and then she hung up and went back to the kitchen. The second time she printed a closure checklist from a small business website and read the first 3 items and put it in the recycling bin under the register. That was 4 years ago. She was 37 now and she ran the bakery alone, and the closure checklist was under something in the recycling bin of a landfill somewhere, and she was still here. There had been a staff once, a counter girl named Priya who had been good with people and had gone back to school for nursing. A part-time baker named Cal who had taken a restaurant job on the other side of the city that paid double what Nadia could offer and had apologised when he told her, which she had appreciated. She had not hired replacements because the math would not allow for replacements. The math was a thing she understood the way people understand things they live inside of, which is to say completely and without comfort. She needed to clear a minimum of $2,200 a month to cover operating costs and the minimum payment on the debt that had been accumulating since her second year of solo operation. She was averaging closer to $1,400 on a good month, $1,100 in January. The gap did not close. Every month it widened by a little, the way a slow crack in a wall widens so gradually you stop seeing it, and then one day you walk by and the wall looks different and you can't remember when that happened. She opened at 6 and closed at 2. She baked from 4 in the morning. She went home tired in a way that was not just the body, but the thing underneath the body, the place where decisions live. She had a line of credit at the bank that she had not looked at the full balance of in 3 months because looking at it didn't change it. And the last time she had looked, it made her sit in the car in the parking lot for 10 minutes before she could drive home. She had thought about talking to her sister about it, but her sister had her own life and her own concerns, and Nadia did not see the use in putting her worry into someone else's house. She kept the lights on anyway. If you had asked her in those cold pre-dawn hours why she was still doing it, she would have said it was her mother's place, which was true. She would have said she did not know what else she would do, which was also true. She would have said she believed it could still turn around, and that was true in the way that things are true when you are not quite sure but cannot afford to stop. What she would not have said, because she was not the kind of woman who said such things out loud, was that one part of why she stayed was a man named Mr. Odell. His full name was Odell Bernard Price. He had been coming to Layla's since before Nadia took over, which her mother had mentioned in passing in the way you mentioned furniture that has always been there. He came on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays without exception at 7:15 in the morning, and he ordered 1 cup of black coffee and 1 slice of whatever bread was freshest that day with butter on the side. He did not vary this order. He sat at the small table near the window, the one with the wobbly leg that Nadia had shimmed with a folded paper coaster 4 years ago and never properly fixed, and he read a newspaper, a real paper one, the kind you had to unfold, and he stayed for exactly 45 minutes. He was 73 years old. He was lean and slow-moving, with a kind of careful economy in his gestures that suggested he had once been much faster and had simply made peace with taking his time. His skin was a deep, rich umber brown, warm at the surface like old mahogany in good light. His hair was close-cropped and almost entirely white, and he kept a short, neat beard with the same silver running through it. His eyes were dark and patient. He wore a pressed collared shirt, always tucked in with a cardigan over it in the cooler months, and a clean, navy windbreaker when the weather was warm enough. He had been wearing that windbreaker as long as Nadia could remember, and she had sometimes wondered if it was the same one or whether he simply owned several identical windbreakers and had decided at some point that it did not matter. He always said the same thing when he came in. He said, "Morning, Nadia." And she said, "Morning, Mr. Odell." And he said, "What's good today?" And she told him what was freshest. And he said, "That'll do just fine." He tipped $2 every visit, folded once, placed under the rim of the saucer rather than left on the table, which she had noticed the 3rd time he did it, and had never commented on. He read his paper. He left at 8 o'clock. He had never in 4 years missed a Tuesday, a Thursday, or a Saturday. There were days when he was the first one in and the only one for a long stretch, and those were the days she was most grateful for him without quite naming it as gratitude. January especially. The deep cold Tuesdays when the walk-in traffic was 3 customers between 6 and noon. Those mornings she would stand in the kitchen hearing the silence and telling herself to stop listening for it. And then, at 7:15, the bell above the door would ring, and she would hear him settle into his chair and the sound of him unfolding his newspaper, and the whole morning would feel as though it had a shape to it again, a reason. She noticed things about him the way you notice things about someone you see reliably over time. Not intrusively, just the accumulation of small truths. He took his coffee on the warm side, not hot. He always read the front section first, then folded it back and read something interior, and he moved through both halves without hurrying, which she found calming to watch from the kitchen. He sometimes looked out the window between paragraphs at the street with an expression that was not so much far away as simply at rest. He kept his hands on the table when he read, not fidgeting, just present. Some mornings he seemed tired and some mornings he seemed perfectly well, and on the mornings he seemed tired, she brought the coffee without waiting to be waved at, and he always said thank you in the same measured way, not effusive, just genuine. One Tuesday in February, in her second winter running the place alone, a pipe in the back wall had started dripping during the night, and by the time she came in at 4, the puddle under the prep counter was 6 inches across. She had mopped it and called the building manager and left messages and mopped again, and by the time she opened at 6, she was already behind on the morning bake. Mr. Odell came in at 7:15 and sat down and looked at her when she came to the counter and said nothing, just looked, in that patient way of his. She said, "Pipe," by way of explanation. He said, "I know a plumber." She said she was handling it. He nodded once and drank his coffee and read his paper. But when he left, he put a phone number on a card on the table beside the saucer, and the plumber he sent came that afternoon and fixed the pipe in under an hour and charged her half what a cold call plumber would have charged. And when she called the number on the card to thank Mr. Odell, it went to voicemail, and he did not mention it the next Thursday. That was the kind of man he was. She did not think he knew the full weight of what she was carrying, because she had not told him, and she had no reason to imagine he had guessed. He was a man of dignity and reserve, and she was not the type to set her financial anxieties on a customer's table next to the butter dish. But there were moments when he looked at her across the counter with that dark, patient gaze, and she had the sense that he saw more than the counter, and the bread, and the tired smile she kept ready. She could not have said what he saw. She only knew that it did not feel like being overlooked. In the months after her mother died, he had said very little about it, because he was not a man who used many words for the things that mattered. He had set his hand briefly on the counter on the first Tuesday after the funeral, not touching hers, just a flat palm on the worn wood, and he had said, "Your mother made this place what it is." Then he had sat down and read his paper. Nadia had gone back to the kitchen and let herself cry for a few minutes before coming back out to slice the bread, and she had been grateful in a way she could not express that he had not waited around for her to say something, or asked if she was okay, or done any of the things that required her to assemble a response. She had a daughter named Simone, 9 years old, who spent the school week with Nadia's sister across town so Nadia could keep the bakery's hours. This was a fact of their life that Nadia did not examine too closely, because examining it too closely led to a particular kind of ache she could not afford to carry through a 12-hour shift. Simone came on Saturdays and sometimes Sundays. She was a child of decided opinions and limited tolerance for nonsense, and she would pull on her coat and plant herself at the wobbly-legged table with a notebook and draw things in absolute seriousness while Nadia worked the counter. She drew the counter sometimes, and the loaves in the case, and once she drew Mr. Odell from memory and showed it to Nadia at home that evening. Nadia looked at the drawing. It was a reasonable likeness, the calm face, the neat collar, the hands on the table. She said, "That's pretty good, baby." Simone said, "He's always there." Nadia looked at the drawing for another moment. She said, "Yes, he is." Simone said, "Is he going to be there forever?" Nadia folded the drawing carefully and put it on the counter where she kept the things that mattered. She said, "I don't know. I hope for a long time." The small business advisor she had seen in late October was a woman named Dr. Reeves, with a clean desk and a direct manner that Nadia appreciated because she had no use for softness around hard numbers. Dr. Reeves had reviewed the operating statements for 12 months and had been quiet for a while after. And then she had said, "The fundamentals here are very thin." Nadia had said she knew. Dr. Reeves had suggested several things, all sensible, most of which Nadia had already tried or considered. She had gently raised the possibility that Nadia think carefully about her path forward and whether the business was viable in its current form. Nadia had said she would think about it. She had driven back to the bakery and pulled a batch of cornbread from the oven and stood in the kitchen by herself for a while, looking at the pale walls and the shelf of spice jars above the prep counter and the cooling rack her mother had bought at an estate sale in 2003 because it was the exact right size. And she had cried quietly, the kind of crying you do when you've gotten used to doing it without making noise. She had not made a decision after that. She had made more bread. On the second Tuesday in November, Mr. Odell came in at 7:15, the same as always, said good morning, asked what was good, and sat down with his coffee and his slice of the rosemary sea salt loaf she had made that morning. He ate with the same unhurried concentration he brought to everything, and he read the front section of his paper and then the interior section, and at 5 minutes to 8, he folded it and stood. He paused at the counter. He was wearing the navy windbreaker and a dark grey knit cap she had not seen before, pulled down over his ears. The morning outside was grey and cutting, and the cold was the kind that came off the bay and found gaps in your coat. His breath showed slightly in the chill that came through the door gap when the woman before him left. He said, "Nadia, I need you to hold something for me." She looked up from the register. He was holding a small envelope, manila, the kind with the little metal clasp at the back, maybe 4 inches by 6. He had it in his cardigan pocket. She could see the slight square shape where it had been. It was light in the way envelopes are light when what's inside is paper and not much else. She said, "Hold it how?" He said, "In the back, in the kitchen, somewhere safe." She looked at him. He was watching her with that patient, steadied look he always had, the one that made her feel like he was seeing the whole room when everyone else only saw the part in front of them. She said, "You okay, Mr. Odell?" He said, "Just fine. but I'm going into the hospital Thursday for a procedure. They're putting me under, and I'd rather this not be sitting at home." She took the envelope. It was lighter than it looked. The clasp was sealed tight, nothing written on the outside. He said, "Don't open it unless I ask you to." She said she wouldn't. He nodded once, adjusted his knit cap and said, "See you Thursday," and he left. She stood at the counter and watched him walk past the window toward the east, his hands in his pockets, unhurried. He did not come Thursday. She was not worried at first. Procedures had recovery times. He was sensible, and he knew his own body, and he had said it was not serious. She put the envelope in the cabinet above the prep counter, behind the shelf of spice jars, where she kept the deed copy and the insurance certificate and the laminated health inspection cards. She set it carefully, propped against the back of the shelf where it would not fall. She went home that night later than usual, locked up in the dark, and did not sleep especially well. He did not come Saturday. Now she was worried. She had no phone number for him. She had never needed one before, had never once in 4 years needed to reach him outside these walls. And the fact that she had no way to reach him now felt suddenly like a failure of a thing she should have thought of. She didn't know his address beyond the general direction he walked from, which was east on Clement toward the older residential blocks. She thought about the envelope in the cabinet and what was in it, and why he had wanted it kept here, and specifically here. That evening she called the nearest hospital, which took longer than she expected because she had only a full name and a rough age, and the hospitals could not confirm or deny anything for privacy reasons, which she understood but which did not help. She called 2 other hospitals and got similar responses. She left a message at the last one asking if there was anyone she could speak to, and no one called back. She waited. She opened the bakery on Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday. The mornings were the same as they had always been, the dark kitchen and the rising dough and the oven heat and the flour on her forearms. But the mornings felt wrong in a way she did not want to examine. A gap that was the size and shape of a man in a navy windbreaker at a small table with a wobbly leg. She thought about his hand on the counter after her mother's funeral. She thought about the card with the plumber's number. She thought about Simone's drawing, the calm face with the hands folded on the table, and the question Simone had asked, the one she had said she hoped for a long time. On the 8th day after the procedure, she almost opened the envelope. She stood at the cabinet and took it down and held it and turned it over. She thought about the clasp and whether it would open clean or tear the paper. She put it back. He came in on the 2nd Thursday after the procedure, at 7:23, 8 minutes late, which was the first time in 4 years he had been anything other than precise. He moved differently, more slowly, the way people move when they are being careful with themselves and have made peace with the care. His face was thinner. He had the navy windbreaker and the grey knit cap and the same dark, patient eyes. She brought him his coffee without waiting to be asked, and she stood at the edge of the table. She said, "Mr. O'Dell, I'm glad to see you." He looked up at her. He said, "Sit down a minute, Nadia." She sat. He said, "The procedure went fine. They did what they needed to do. I'll be doing some recovery at my son's place in Sacramento for a while." He looked at the table. "That's why I'm telling you now. I'll be going at the end of the week." She said, "For how long?" He said, "I don't know exactly. Through the spring, maybe." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm 73 years old. My son and his wife have been asking me to spend more time out there for 2 years now. I think it's probably time to listen." She looked at the table, at the shimmed table leg, at the paper coaster that had been sitting under there for 4 years. She said, "We'll be here when you get back." He looked at her directly when she said that. He said, "I know you will." He drank his coffee and read his paper. He stayed longer than usual, almost an hour, which she noticed without saying so. When he stood to leave, he said, "That envelope, I'd like you to open it now." She brought it from the cabinet. She stood at the counter with it, the cool metal clasp under her thumb, and he settled back into his chair and she worked the clasp open and tipped it over. 2 things came out. The first was a handwritten recipe, 3 pages, both sides, written in a close and careful hand on lined paper with the kind of blue pen that is almost black. It was for a sweet potato pound cake, and it was unlike any recipe she had seen before, which was saying something real because she had been reading recipes since she was 8 years old in this kitchen. It used a specific type of unrefined cane sugar she had heard of but never sourced. The spice ratio was its own thing, warm and complicated, the kind that takes time to recognize on the tongue because the flavors come in sequence rather than all at once. The method for incorporating the butter was particular and precise, the kind of instruction that tells you whoever wrote it had made this so many times that they could feel when it was right without measuring. There were margin notes in the same careful hand, small and dense, adjustments for weather and altitude and oven variation, a note in the right margin of the second page that said, for a drier day, add 2 tablespoons cream, and at the bottom of the third page, underlined once, the words, "This is the one." The second thing was a folded piece of paper. She opened it. He waited while she read. She read it twice. When she looked up, her eyes were full, and she was not a woman who cried easily. He said, "My grandmother developed that recipe in 1958. She sold that cake out of her kitchen in Alabama for 30 years for church socials and funerals and the occasional wedding, and people drove to her street from 3 towns over when they heard she was baking. When she passed, the recipe went to me. I am the only one she gave it to." He let that settle. "I have been thinking about what to do with it for a long time. I've been thinking about it every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday for the past 2 years." She pressed one hand over her mouth. The letter was still in her other hand. He said, "You don't have to do anything with it. That recipe is yours now either way, to keep or to use as you choose. But there's a man named Marcus Webb. His contact information is in that letter. He's a food investor, a serious one, and he worked with my nephew on a sauce business 3 years ago, and that went very well. I called him about you 3 weeks ago." He paused. "He knows about the bakery. He knows about the debt. He knows about Simone. I told him what he needed to know. I asked him to take your call." She said, "Mr. Odell," he said, "the cake is the real thing. I have been eating a lot of baked goods across a long life, and I know what the real thing is. With the right backing and the right person behind it, that recipe is worth considerably more than what you owe on this building." She said, "Why me?" It was not quite a question. He seemed to hear it that way. He looked around the small shop, slowly, taking in the flour-dusted counter and the cooling rack and the glass case and the morning light coming in low through the window. He looked at the wobbly-legged table and at the paper coaster wedged under it. He looked back at her. He said, "Because you stayed. Because you have been here every morning with the lights on and the oven warm, making something good when it would have been easier every single day to stop." He was quiet for a moment. "Because your mother built something real in this room, and you would not let it become nothing. And because you let me sit at that table in peace for a long time, when sitting there in peace was the thing I needed most." She did not try not to cry. She let it come quietly, the way she had learned to do things quietly, and he waited with the same patience he had always had, unhurried, as if time was not pressing on either of them. When she had collected herself, he stood and he laid the folded $2 tip under the edge of the saucer the way he always did, and he straightened his knit cap and he said, "Call Marcus. Don't wait on it." She said she would. He said, "Good bread, Nadia, every time." And he walked out into the grey November morning. She stood at the window and watched him go until he turned the corner at the end of the block, and she could not see the navy windbreaker anymore. Then she went to the kitchen, because the kitchen was where she went, and she set the 3 pages of recipe on the prep counter and read them all the way through, both sides, the margin notes and the adjustments, and the line at the bottom of the 3rd page. She read them slowly. She did not hurry. She thought about her mother standing in this kitchen for 31 years. She thought about the kind of faithfulness that doesn't need an audience, the kind that shows up at 4 in the morning in the dark and does the thing because the thing needs doing. She thought about a woman she had never met in Alabama in 1958, standing at a stove and working out the ratios of something that would still exist 67 years later in an envelope in a spice cabinet in California. She thought that was what it looked like, the real thing. Whatever it was, you kept going back to, not because someone was watching, but because you were the kind of person who did not know how to do it any other way. She called Marcus Webb that afternoon. He answered on the second ring, easy and direct, and said, "Odell told me I'd be hearing from you." She told him about the bakery, all of it, the numbers and the debt and the line of credit, and the $1,400 months, and the advisory meeting with Dr. Reeves and the closure checklist she had put in the recycling bin. She said it plainly the way she talked about hard things, which was without apology and without drama. He listened without interrupting, which she noticed because most people interrupted. When she finished, he said, "Can you make the cake tomorrow? I'd like to come taste it before we talk." She said yes. She sourced the cane sugar that evening, driving to a specialty grocery store on the other side of the city that stayed open late, and she stood in the aisle for 5 minutes, reading the bag label to be sure she had the right variety. She came home and read the recipe again at her kitchen table. The 3 pages spread out, Simone asleep in the back room. She ran her finger along the margin note on the second page. For a drier day, add 2 tablespoons cream. She checked the weather on her phone. It would be dry tomorrow. She made a note. Marcus drove from Oakland the next morning and arrived at 10. He was in his early 40s, compact and measured, the kind of man who understood that the most important thing you can do when someone is trying to show you something is to be quiet and pay attention. She made the pound cake from the recipe exactly as written, following the method for the butter with the same precision she brought to everything she made, taking her time at the stage, the notes flagged. The cake came out of the oven at 10:40. She let it cool the proper 40 minutes, watching the clock once, and then she sliced it at the counter in front of him. He took one bite. He set down the fork. He looked at her, and then at the cake, and then at her again. He said, "Odell told me this was the real thing." She waited. He said, "He was right." They talked for 3 hours. He was interested in a licensing and distribution arrangement that would treat Layla's as the originating brand, the recipe as the signature product, and the bakery's history as the story behind the product. He talked about retail distribution, about a regional grocery partnership he already had relationships with, about what it would mean to build a product line around something that was genuinely differentiated, rather than one more variation on a market category. He talked numbers in the way she needed, clearly, with no rounding that hid the uncomfortable parts. What he proposed was a partnership in which she retained ownership of the brand and the Clement Street location, and his fund provided operating capital and retail infrastructure, with the debt folded into the deal structure at a rate that would make it serviceable within a realistic timeline. He needed 60 days to finalize terms, he said. He needed a lawyer on both sides. He wanted to know, in principle, whether she was willing to sit across the table from him. She said yes. She called her sister that night and talked for 45 minutes, which was longer than any phone call she had made in the past year. Her sister made a sound at one point that was not quite crying but was close to it. Simone was in the background asking questions until Nadia's sister redirected her, but at one point Simone grabbed the phone and said, "Mama, did something good happen?" And Nadia said, "Yes, baby. Something very good happened." And Simone said, "Okay," and handed the phone back with the clean satisfaction of a child who only needed the one answer. Nadia sat at her kitchen table after, the 3 recipe pages on one side and her laptop open to the debt spreadsheet on the other. She looked at both for a long time without touching either. She thought about Mr. Odell driving east to Sacramento that week, his navy windbreaker folded on the seat beside him, his newspaper probably in the back. She thought about him calling Marcus 3 weeks before the procedure. She thought about him sitting at that table every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday, with the envelope in his cardigan pocket, not yet ready to say what he had come to say. He had been watching her for 2 years, deciding. She had not known she was being seen. The partnership agreement was signed on a Thursday morning in March, at a conference table in the city. Nadia wore a dark blue dress she had not worn since her cousin's wedding, and she read every page before she signed anything, which took 45 minutes and which she would not have shortened for anyone. When she signed the last page and put down the pen, the lawyer across the table said, "Congratulations," she said. "Thank you." And that was all, because that was enough. The first production run of Layla's sweet potato pound cake shipped to a regional grocery chain the following September. The packaging used an old photograph of Nadia's mother at the original counter, taken sometime in the 90s. Layla's arms crossed and her face carrying the expression of a woman who has decided something and has no need to discuss it. The back panel carried a note that said the recipe had been in the family of a dear friend for 66 years and that it had been made with love and without shortcuts ever since. Both of those things were completely true. The original Layla's on Clement Street was still open. It was open the way it had always been open, which was early and on purpose, with the ovens going at 4 and the first loaves out before 6 and the lights on when the street was still grey. Nadia had hired 2 people to help, a counter girl named Danny, who had a gift for reading the room, and a baker named Thomas, who had come in on a Sunday and asked about the job, and stayed for 3 hours helping prep without being asked, which was how she knew. The case was fuller now. The case lights worked without flickering. The wobbly-legged table had been properly shimmed, a real shim this time, the kind that would not shift, which she had done herself one Tuesday morning before anyone came in, crouched on the floor with the right tool, finally. On Saturdays, Simone came in. She sat at the table, the one by the window, and she did her drawings with absolute seriousness. The same as always, she drew the counter and the case, and Danny at the register, and Thomas carrying trays. Once she drew the paper coaster that had been under the table leg for 4 years, which Nadia had kept and set on the shelf behind the register. Simone drew it the way a child draws something she understands to be important, without being able to say why. Mr. Odell came back in April, on a Tuesday at 7:15. He was walking more easily than he had in November, and the grey knit cap was gone because the weather had turned warm. He sat at his table with the properly fixed leg, and Nadia brought him his coffee and a slice of the new brown butter walnut loaf before he asked for anything, because she had made it that morning thinking he might come today. He looked at the slice, and then at her. He said, "That's new," she said. "Trying some things." He tasted it. He sat with it for a moment the way he sat with everything, without hurry. He said, "That's good, Nadia." She said, "I know." He smiled at that. It was a small smile, unhurried, the way he did everything. He picked up his newspaper and unfolded it, and read the front section and then the interior section, and at 5 to 8 he folded it and stood. He put $2, folded once, under the edge of the saucer. She left it there until after he was gone, the same as always, and then she picked it up and held it for a moment in the kitchen doorway. She thought about the shelf of spice jars and the envelope that had sat behind them through November and into December, patient, waiting. She thought about the recipe on the 3rd page, the last line, the one that was underlined. She thought about what it had meant for him to keep that recipe for 66 years and give it to her. She thought about his grandmother's hands and the stove in Alabama and the 30 years of selling something real to people who came back for it, and about the long chain of faithfulness that ran from that kitchen to this one, through time and across the country, through an old man in a Navy windbreaker sitting at a table with a wobbly leg 3 mornings a week for 4 years. She thought that was what it looked like, the real thing, not the lucky break, not the overnight turn, the thing underneath the thing, the staying, the lights on. The bread made, the $2 under the saucer, the patient accumulation of mornings done right. She slipped the $2 into her apron pocket and went back to the kitchen. The butter was at room temperature, the way she had left it. The oven was already warm. The dough for the afternoon's last batch was rising in the warmer, doing exactly what it needed to do, which was the same thing everything here had always done. It was taking its time. It was not rushing. It knew what it was. She had learned that from her mother, who had learned it from 4 decades of doing this the right way, and she would pass it along in time, maybe to Simone, maybe to someone who came in one morning and stayed. That was how these things travelled. Not in a straight line, not all at once, but faithfully, the way water finds its level, the way bread rises when the conditions are right. She put her hands in the dough, and the morning settled around her, and the street outside the window was fully light now, and somewhere on Clement Street the day smelled like butter and warmth, and the particular sweetness of something worth waiting for. If this story reached something in you, we would love to know. Tell us about someone who kept a light on when the easier thing would have been to walk away, when the math said, stop, and they stayed anyway. Tell us in the comments, because those stories deserve to be told. And if you want another story about what faithfulness looks like when nobody is watching, there is one waiting for you right after this one ends. This is a work of fiction, created for entertainment. Names, characters, businesses and events are imaginary.